Hi. This week's Read Aloud is called Pony Penning Day. It's a short story by Marguerite Henry. It's part of a larger story that she tells in a favorite book of my childhood, Misty of Chincoteague. That was published in 1947. This story will come into two parts. Pony Penning Day by Marguerite Henry. Pony Penning Day always comes on the last Thursday in July. 4 weeks before, every member of the volunteer fire department is busy getting the grounds in readiness, and the boys are allowed to help. "I'll do your chores at home, Paul," offered Maureen, "so as you can see that pony pens are good and stout." Paul spent long days at the pony penning grounds. The pens for the wild ponies must be made safe. Once the Phantom was captured, she must not escape. Nothing else mattered. Paul and Maureen Beebe lived on their grandfather's pony ranch on the island of Chincoteague, just off the Virginia shore. Across a narrow channel lay another island, Chincoteague, which was the home of the wild herds. They were said to be the descendants of a bunch of Spanish horses off a Spanish galleon, which had been shipwrecked there several hundred years ago. Once, every July, the men of Chincoteague crossed the channel to Chincoteague and rounded up the wild ponies. They swam them across the channel to Chincoteague to be sold on Pony Penning Day. Paul and Maureen had gentled many a wild colt, but just as the colt was learning that they were his friends, Grandpa Beebe would sell it, and the children would never see him again. They had earned $100 to buy a horse of their own, and the horse they wanted was the Phantom. This was the mysterious wild mare about whom so many stories were told. None of the roundup men had ever been able to capture her. But this year, Paul was old enough to go with the men, and he was determined to get her. "When I do," he said, "I'll tie a rope around her neck to show she's already sold to us." The night before the roundup, he and Maureen made last-minute plans in Phantom's stall. "First thing in the morning," Paul told Maureen, "you lay a clean bed of dried seagrass. Then fill the manger with plenty of marsh grass to make Phantom feel at home." "Oh, I will, Paul. And I've got some ear corn and some 'lasses to coax her appetite. And Grandma gave me a bunch of tiny new carrots and some rutabagas, and I've been saving up sugar until I have a little sackful." It was dark and still when Paul awoke the next morning. He lay quiet a moment, trying to gather his wits. Suddenly he shot out of bed. Today was Pony Penning Day. He dressed quickly and thudded barefoot down to the kitchen, where Grandma stood over the stove frying ham and making coffee for him, as if he were a man grown. After a hurried breakfast, he ran out the door. He mounted Watch Eyes, a dependable pony that Grandpa had never been able to sell because of his white eyes. Locking his bare feet around the pony's sides, he jogged out of the yard. Maureen came running to see him off. "Whatever happens," Paul called back over his shoulder, "you be at Old Dominion Point at 10 o'clock on a fresh pony." "I'll be there, Paul." "And you, Paul," yelled Grandpa, "obey your leader, no matter what." Day was breaking. A light golden mist came out of the sea. It touched the prim white houses and the white picket fences with an unearthly light. Paul loped along slowly to save his mount's strength. All along the road men were turning out of their gates. "Where do you reckon you'll do most good, bub?" taunted a lean sapling of a man. He guffawed loudly, then winked at the rest of the group. Paul's hand tightened on the reins. "Reckon I'll do most good where the leader tells me to go," he said, blushing hotly. The day promised to be sultry. The marsh grass that usually billowed and waved stood motionless. The water of Chincoteague Channel glared like quicksilver. Now the cavalcade was thundering over a small bridge that linked Chincoteague Island to Little Piney Island. At the far end of the bridge, a scow with a rail fence around it stood at anchor. In spite of light talk, the faces of the men were drawn tight with excitement as they led their mounts onto the scow. The horses felt the excitement too. Their nostrils quivered, and their ears swiveled this way and that, listening to the throb of the motor. Now the scow began to nose its way across the narrow channel. Paul watched the white hills of Chincoteague loom near. He watched the old lighthouse grow sharp and sharper against the sky. In a few minutes, the ride was over. The gangway was being lowered. The horses were clattering down, each man taking his own. All eyes were on Wiley Maddox, the leader. "Split in 3 bunches," Wiley clipped out the directions loud and sharp. "North, south, and east. Me and Kim and the BB boy will head east. Wimbrow and Quillen go north. Harvey and Rogers south. We'll all meet at Tom's Point." Paul touched his bare heels into Watch-Eye's side. They were off. The boy's eyes were fastened on Wiley Maddox. He and Kim Horsepepper were following their leader, like the wake of a ship. As they rode on, Paul could feel the soft sand give way to hard meadowland, then to pine-laden trails. There were no paths to follow, only openings to skim through, openings that led to water holes or to grazing grounds. The 3 horses thrashed through underbrush, jumped fallen trees, waded brackish pools and narrow winding streams. Suddenly, Paul saw Wiley Maddox's horse rear into the air. He heard him neigh loudly as a band of wild ponies darted into an open grazing stretch some 20 yards ahead, then vanished among the black tree trunks. The woods came alive with thundering hooves and frantic horse calls. Through brush and briar, bog and hard marshland the wild ponies flew. Behind them galloped the 3 riders, whooping at the top of their lungs. For whole seconds at a time, the wild band would be swallowed up by the forest gloom. Then it would reappear far ahead, nothing but a flash of flying tails and manes. Suddenly, Wiley Maddox was waving Paul to ride close. "A straggler!" he shouted, pointing off to the left. "He went that-a-way! Get him!" And with a burst of speed, Wiley Maddox and Kim Horsepepper were after the band. Paul was alone. His face reddened with anger. They wanted to be rid of him. That's what they wanted. Sent after a straggler? He was not interested in rounding up a straggler that couldn't even keep up with the herd. He wanted the phantom. Then Grandpa's words flashed across his mind. "You, Paul, obey your leader, no matter what." He wheeled his pony and headed blindly in the direction Wiley had indicated. He rode deeper into the pine thicket, trying to avoid snapping twigs, yet watching ahead for the slightest motion of leaf or bush. He'd show the men if it took him all day. His thin shirt clung to him damply, and his body was wet with sweat. A cobweb veiled itself across his face. With one hand he tried to wipe it off, but suddenly he was almost unseated. Watch-Eyes was dancing on his hind legs, his nose high in the air. Paul stared into the sun-dappled forest, until his eyes burned in his head. At last, far away and deep in the shadow of the pines, he saw a blur of motion. With the distance that lay between them, it might have been anything, a deer or even a squirrel. Whatever it was, he was after it. Tune in for part 2.